So let's talk about the history of modern India. I mean, it's this huge, sprawling story, right? You've got empires, massive rebellions, the birth of a nation. It can feel, honestly, a little overwhelming to even know where to start. But what if there was a way to chart a clear path through it all? All right, let's dive in. And that really is the big question, isn't it? How do you possibly make sense of centuries of change, of conflict, of this incredible transformation without just getting totally lost in all the names and dates? Well, when you're trying to navigate a huge, unfamiliar territory, you start with a map. Simple as that. And for our purposes here, our map is going to be the table of contents from a fantastic book, Rajiv Ahir's A Brief History of Modern India. Now, don't worry, we're not going to sit here and read a table of contents. No way. We're going to use it. Think of it as our guide, our GPS for navigating this epic story. See, by just following the structure of the book itself, we can break this huge, immense history down into really clear, totally manageable stages. It's honestly the most direct route we can take to really get a handle on the whole journey. So, our journey breaks down into four main stages. First up, the arrival of European powers, and how the British eventually consolidated their rule. Then, stage two, the Indian response, and this is key through both resistance and reform. Third, we'll look at how that response started to grow and morph into a full-blown nationalist movement. And finally, we'll get to the last really dramatic steps towards forging a new nation. Okay, so let's get into stage one. When we think about the story of modern India, it's so often framed just around the British. But here's the thing. They were far, far from the first Europeans to actually show up on the scene. In fact, there was this whole succession of powers, all jockeying for position, all trying to trade and establish some influence. The Portuguese were actually the first ones in. Then came the Dutch, then the English, the French, and yep, even the Danes got in on the action. It was a seriously crowded and super competitive field. So that just leads to the obvious question, right? With all of these powerful European companies fighting for a piece of the pie, how in the world did the English East India Company end up on top, eventually dominating the entire subcontinent? Well, it turns out their big advantage wasn't just about having better guns. As we can see here, it was a whole system. Think about it. A disciplined military motivated by getting paid regularly and on time, strong financial backing from back home, brilliant, well-supported leadership, and you combine all that with this really powerful sense of national pride. Each one of these things fed into the others, creating this incredibly effective, almost unstoppable force for expansion. All right, so that's how they took control. But that brings us to stage two, because the consolidation of British power was absolutely not a passive event. People didn't just stand by. The Indian subcontinent reacted, and that reaction, well, it took many, many different forms. And the most immediate reaction was, of course, direct resistance. Right from the very beginning, as British power expanded, it was met with opposition on the ground, period. And this resistance wasn't just one single thing. The source material does a great job of breaking it down. You had civil rebellions, often led by rulers who'd been kicked out. You had peasant movements protesting these really harsh economic policies. You had tribal revolts, people fighting to protect their land and their way of life. And you even had mutinies by the Indian soldiers, the sepoys, from within the company's own army. But here's a crucial point. The response wasn't just fought with weapons. It was also fought with ideas. There was this profound intellectual and social awakening happening as people were really trying to grapple with the incredibly rapid changes that were being forced on their society. And this really boils down to two main currents of thought. On one side, you had the reformists. These folks believed in modernizing society from the inside out. But on the other side, you had the revivalists. They argued for going back, for returning to what they saw as the pure, original forms of their traditions. And both of these were incredibly powerful ways of responding to the challenges of the time. Okay, so this brings us right to our third major stage. Because now you have to ask, how did all these scattered acts of resistance, all these different ideas about reform, how did they all start to come together to merge into a single powerful force we now call the Indian nationalist movement? Well, the movement itself grew up in stages. It kicked off with what's called the era of the moderates. These guys focused on petitions and trying to get constitutional reforms. That was followed by the rise of militant nationalism, which, as the name suggests, pushed for much more direct action. But the real shift, the total game changer, was when it became an era of mass nationalism. And that massive shift is really synonymous with one name, I mean, the title of chapter 15 in our book says it all: The Emergence of Gandhi. His arrival on the scene literally transformed the freedom struggle from something led by elites into a nationwide campaign that brought in millions and millions of ordinary people. And that powerful mass movement is what carries us straight into our fourth and final stage, the incredibly turbulent, complex, and honestly, world-changing final years of the struggle for independence. I mean, this final period was just a total whirlwind. You had the Quit India movement, which mobilized the entire nation. At the very same time, the call for a separate state, Pakistan, was getting louder and stronger. And then, layered on top of all of that, you have World War II, which just completely upended the global power dynamic. All of these incredible forces were crashing together, all converging on one outcome: the transfer of power and the absolutely brutal reality of partition. And so, there it is. Our map has guided us all the way through this incredibly turbulent journey. It took us from the first arrival of European traders to the rise of a massive empire, through acts of rebellion and waves of reform, to the birth of a true mass movement, and finally to the destination: a free but tragically partitioned India. Understanding this history, this roadmap of how a nation was forged, it's not just about looking backwards. It gives us a pretty powerful framework for understanding the present. So the final question I want to leave you with is this: what does this map of a nation's birth teach us? Not just about its past journey, but about the path that still lies ahead.